positive psychology is great on the good days. It's essential on the bad. And I have so many stories from our diploma students. So we run a diploma of positive psychology and wellbeing. And so many of our diploma students who have messaged me during this whole pandemic and said, I am so glad I learned these strategies before this hit because I've got the tools to deal with it.
Hello and welcome to episode 9 of the Living and Leading with Emotional Intelligence podcast. I'm your host, Brittney-Nichole. In today's interview, we will be speaking with global speaker and consultant Sue Langley. Sue lives in Australia, and I just happened to stumble across some of her videos on YouTube and connect with her through LinkedIn. But to give you a little bit about Sue, so Sue Langley is the CEO and founder of the Langley Group and travels the globe engaging people from all walks of life. Her ability to energize teams for change, develop resilience and well-being in others, and to inspire leaders to be the best that they can be makes her one of the most sought-after speakers in her field. Sue has worked with thousands of business leaders, HR professionals, managers, and consultants to help them learn how to harness the brain's potential, create positive workplace cultures, and increase performance and productivity. Sue specializes in the practical applications of neuroscience, emotional intelligence, and positive psychology, synthesizing the science and research into simple, practical tools that anyone can use. Sue also has a program which is a diploma of positive psychology that I would recommend checking out. She'll talk a little bit more about that in this episode. But I love this conversation with Sue because this episode includes so many things regarding psychology, emotional intelligence, and it really addresses a lot of the misconceptions that people have about positive psychology. I think when people hear positive psychology, they automatically assume that it's about always feeling happy and being in this positive emotional state and not feeling those other emotions like sadness and anger and frustration. And that is not true whatsoever. She talks about parenting and emotional intelligence. She talks about workplace environment, emotional intelligence, so much more. I mean, there's just like a plethora of things about emotional intelligence and psychology here. And she also brings in the science behind this. So much to cover in this episode. So without further ado, here's the interview with Sue Langley. All right. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Hi, Sue. It's a pleasure to speak with you. And thank you so much for coming on the Living and Leading with Emotional Intelligence show/podcast. It really is an honor and pleasure to have you. I found you on LinkedIn, and then I kind of just dove into a lot of your material and your talks, and I loved your positive energy. So will you introduce yourself and just tell the audience who you are and what you do?
So my name is Sue Langley, and I am the CEO of the Langley Group and academic director of the Langley Group Institute. Who am I? I think that's an interesting one. I'm a person who tries to live and breathe their purpose, vision, and values every day. And that's really how I got into this, of deciding who I wanted to be, how I wanted to live, and what life I wanted to create, and then creating my business around that. What do? I share knowledge and facilitate learning. That's what I do every day. And I do it around the practical application of positive psychology, emotional intelligence, and neuroscience, and the intersection between those three scientific fields.
So I was watching one of your speeches, and I loved it because you were talking about, I believe it was a Prada. Was it a Prada purse?
Yeah, positive psychology and Prada.
Yeah, and but I love the way that you talked about it, because at first I was like, okay, I don't know if materials really make us happy, but what you were saying was it wasn't the fact that it was a Prada. It wasn't the fact that like you wanted to brag about it and show it to the world. It was about what it brought to you. So can you talk about the role that had in your life? Like, how does that tie into emotional intelligence and positive psychology?
Yeah, sure. So you've often hear the both research and probably what your nan said of, things don't make you happy. But what they found through research from a positive psychology perspective is material things are not as likely to make us as happy as experiences or things for self compared to things for others. So research in general has found if I spend my money or my time on experiential things that maybe connect with other people or make a difference or contribute, it will have a greater impact on my overall emotional well-being than just buying stuff and getting caught up on that hedonic treadmill that we can sometimes have of, oh, now I've got to have the next big TV or the next big this or whatever.
Right.
And so the purpose of my speech, Positive Psychology and Prada, was to say, well, how can we use the learning about positive psychology and emotions and how this works for us? How can we use that knowledge to get more out of our potential material elements? So we know, for instance, that anticipation of bringing up those positive emotions in anticipation of something is really useful. Like if you've ever planned a holiday, the planning and the anticipation and the researching things and what shall you do, that generates really beautiful positive emotions. So my story about the positive psychology in Prada was the 10 years leading up to it of me wanting a Prada handbag. Then we also know from the research that savoring and being present and being in the moment and savoring through all our senses is really good for our well-being. So then my story was, well, how did I savor during my trip to Italy, of going into Prada shops and savoring that moment, savoring the moment when I actually purchased it and they put the bag in the bag in the bag. And I'm like, oh my God, they actually do this in shops. And then also we know from research that reminiscing in a positive way is really useful for regenerating positive emotions that I may have experienced when I was savoring. So the story then goes on, well, how do you, when you've purchased something material, how do you reconnect with it in a way that it doesn't just become, an old handbag and now I need a new one, but what is it that I can really savor and enjoy and going back to remembering purchasing it, remember being in Italy, all of those sorts of things. So really that sort of story is how do we bring together elements of the science of emotions and say, well, how do we leverage in a positive way in our day-to-day life? And as you picked up, the story is not about a Prada handbag at all. The story is about life of, are we just running through it, not even noticing or leveraging those opportunities for positivity?
And I love how you mentioned being present and appreciating it and enjoying the experience, because I work with people who they make a lot of money, they can have anything they want, but they're never satisfied. But it's because they're not, once they have that, like you said, they just kind of like, okay, now I need something else. But the difference is that savoring that and being present and appreciating and having gratitude. And I think those are the key components there. Because I think there's that fine line, right, between the dopamine addiction for that next thing, that high, and then the serotonin for something that's showing appreciation and being present.
Well, I mean, dopamine is a reward sensation, but what often happens is the dopamine hit comes just before we're about to do the things that give us a reward to propel us to do it. So actually, by the time we've done it, we're like, oh, okay, that was nice. But we've already had the little hit. So I suppose what we know from the science is, rather than just knowing the science, let's use the science. Let's use it in a way that even when we're purchasing something that might be classified as material, how do we leverage all those other really good things? And for me, it's, I was like a child, I'm sure, like, oh my God, they're actually putting a bag in a bag in a bag. How do they do this? And touching it and whatever. Whereas I suppose if you've bought 50 million handbags, maybe you don't care and you don't even notice, and you're probably not even talking to the assistant or noticing who they are. You've just handed over your credit card and that's it, or purchased online. But we know that that doesn't build overall well-being. And I suppose if you come back to the key elements of emotional intelligence, one of the first things is being able to perceive emotions. Well, if I've kind of numbed my emotions down to this sort of relatively neutral point that nothing really helps me experience that gratitude and appreciation and that joy and that excitement, then I don't know, maybe life's not quite so exciting and we're needing the next bigger high, just like a drug, in order to live a fulfilling life.
So how do you approach self-awareness, which is the foundational component of emotional intelligence? How do you approach that with positive psychology?
Oh, look, I mean, positive psychology and EI are really two sides of the same orange or whatever it is. They're really integrated, because when you think about emotional intelligence, I think emotions are the underpinning of everything. You might know that exercising is good for your well-being, but if you're in a grumpy, miserable, negative mood, you're still not getting off your sofa. So being able to be aware of your emotions, perceive your emotions, pick up on those emotions is really critical, because it's kind of the first step to then doing something about them if you want to shift them. But I think one of the key things, and it's the whole science of what they call interoception, which is how we pick up on the experiences in our body. And for instance, we know there have been examples where people have experienced pain in their shoulder, but it's actually their kidney, but it's because the neural pathways cross over in the spine. We know there have been examples where people have experienced what they think is butterflies in their stomach on a first date and end up they've got food poisoning. Because our ability to perceive our emotions is sometimes takes time, it takes effort, we have to pay attention. And often what happens is we kind of turn off from that when we get to adulthood. We don't listen, we don't pay attention to the emotional data, if you like, that our body is sending us. And I always talk about emotions as data. That's all they are. They're data, they're information, they're trying to tell us something. And if you think about a child, a 2-year-old child, when they experience anger, every single cell of their body is experiencing anger. When they're excited, they're bursting to the seams. But of course, as we become older and we get into our prefrontal cortex and we have to think more clearly and we have to be more logical and rational and all this sort of stuff, we tend to stop noticing or paying attention to the physiological sensations. And yet, basically, your body is trying to send you messages all of the time. It's trying to tell you what's going on. Right now, the situation we're in with the pandemic, people are experiencing frustration, they're experiencing stress, they're experiencing anxiety. They're all perfectly normal emotions to be experiencing. And when you notice that you're suddenly tensing your shoulders, or your jaw's been clenched, or your stomach's churning and you don't want to eat, they are perfectly normal elements of data that is being sent through to your brain based on what you're experiencing. And we need to get better at that.
Yeah. And I don't think it helps whenever parents are always trying to tell their kids, calm down, go sit in the corner. We're telling our kids what to do, how they should behave. Here's the social norms. Here's how you should react. And then, as you said, as we grow up and become adults, then that becomes the new script that's running through us. And we don't learn to be tuned in to those feelings because we've been taught to kind of, in a way, suppress it in some sense.
Yeah, and people sometimes get mistaken between the difference between emotional intelligence and being emotional. We're not saying everybody should be running around like 2-year-olds. Emotional intelligence.
No, definitely not. That, even though some do, there's quite a few people that do. Yes.
Absolutely. Emotional intelligence is just the intelligent use of emotions. How do we use them intelligently? But I think to your point is actually being able to tap in and really being able to understand the data that you're experiencing is really useful for us. It's useful for us to take the science and use it to then help us. And if you think about children, what often happens as a parent, we are trying to take those negative emotions away from our child for the right reasons. Your child is sad, you want to give them a hug and make it all better. Your child is anxious, you want to pat, make it all better, make the anxiety go away. The only challenge with that, the minute we do that, we're invalidating the child's emotion and we're teaching them that mum or dad will fix it. And I think that's a really important thing of helping a child and an adult sit with an emotion. It's okay to feel anxious. It's perfectly normal. But actually getting, and this is a phrase I use all the time, comfortable with the uncomfortable emotions is actually really valuable to us.
Yeah. Because like you said, behind every emotion, there's a message. We need to listen to what that message is telling us.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So with parents, since you got on the subject with children, so how do you advise a parent because a parent needs to be in tune with their emotions as well, right? It's hard to direct their children if they're out of touch with their own feelings. So how would you advise a parent to kind of find those tools to become aware of their emotions and how to use those tools to work with their children?
Yeah, and I mean, there's some great books on this subject as well. John Gottman's Raising an Emotionally Intelligent Child, I think, is fabulous
I
for
just
many
got that in the
parents.
mail yesterday.
It's a
It's
great
like,
book.
what, 1997, but I just got it in the mail yesterday. I'm looking forward
It's
to
a
reading
really
it.
good book, oldie but a goodie. But I think your key point is, as an adult, if I'm not comfortable with my emotions, whatever they might be, when I'm feeling anxious, when I'm feeling sad, etc., if I don't have the strategies, then I'm not teaching my child effective strategies. So we can't expect a child that if I feel sad, I think reaching for gin and tonic is the best answer. We can't expect the child to then figure out how to deal with sadness if I'm not. If when I get angry, I yell at my partner or whatever that's what I'm teaching my child. So I think the key thing is how can I learn those strategies myself? And I may have had great role models, growing up, lucky me, but I may not. So how do I sort of tap in and listen to what's going on? And I use the science all the time. I use the sort of the ability-based framework, and I basically go, okay, what am I feeling right now? That's my first thing. If I'm with somebody else, what are they feeling right now? Then I'll ask myself, okay, how is this influencing my thinking? Well, if I'm feeling grumpy, flat and down, it's going to influence my thinking, as in I'm going to see all the negative things and the horrible things and every life's terrible, etc.
Exactly.
And then I go, well, what's triggering this? Okay, well, if I'm sad, it's a loss. So sadness tends to come from loss of something of value. Okay, yeah, well, I have lost something I value. I've lost, I don't know, whatever it might be, my job, my freedom, whatever might be going on for people right now. And therefore, I then go to manage emotions. Well, how do I manage it? Well, I need to think about, okay, well, I've lost. Is it somebody I love, in which case I might need to manage my emotions through grief and strategies around that? Or actually, am I getting caught up in my own thinking and I really haven't lost that much at all? I might have lost a bit of my freedom, but I've still got my job, I've still got people who love me, etc. So managing emotions could be a whole bunch of different strategies that I then do. But the key thing is to notice it first, because what I don't want is that my emotion carries me away, takes everybody else on a negative journey with me, and before I know it, all the people around me are grumpy and miserable.
Exactly. And when you have that amygdala hijacking, some people call it amygdala hijacking, some people call it emotional hijacking, whatever it is, we're not able to think rationally. So all those wonderful things that you just talked through and how your emotions are impacting someone else, and really, instead of projecting those onto others, we're not really thinking about that all the time. And like you said, it's about being aware of that. That's the key. But what suggestions do you have to bring that awareness? Because it does take time, right? It's not something that happens overnight. So what are some practices that you would recommend?
Yeah, and I think the key word that you mentioned there is practice. And I know nobody wants to hear this. They just want to read a book and all of a sudden they're awesome at it. But if you want to play World Cup football, you don't just run out on the pitch and woohoo, I've never played before, but now I'm going to be the world's best. It's kind of a bit like that with emotional intelligence. And I had this lovely lady once, we do an exercise on some of our programs where we get people to experience an emotion. And it's kind of sounds a bit weird initially, but most people sort of go through it and they're like, oh yes, I felt this, I felt that, etc. And from a physiological perspective. And this one lady, she was like, no, I felt nothing, got nothing, no sensations, no nothing. And at the end of the 2 days, we've done other things, but she said one of her key activities and actions moving forward was to try and practice the exercise that we'd done and see if she could generate some physiological sensations. And to her credit, she decided that every morning when she walked her dog, she was going to stop at a certain point for 5 minutes, do this exercise and see what happened. And of course, I forgot about it. And then about 6 weeks later, I get a text from her saying, oh my God, I felt something this morning. Now, to her credit, she'd been practicing every day. And I think that's what people don't want to hear. Same with positive psychology. If you want your well-being to increase, positive psychology is not a spectator sport. You don't just watch read a book or watch a, TED talk on it and go, oh, well, my well-being is going to increase. You actually have to do it every day. I have strategies I do every single day without fail. And I know if I stopped doing them, my well-being would drop. But they are things I do every single day. And guess what? Because we know the brain is plastic, after a while, they become habitual, they become easier. So therefore, you might need to shake it up, be a bit more curious, add something else to the mix. And to your point about the amygdala hijack, I can't remember the last time I've had an amygdala hijack, to be perfectly honest. And if we think about how the brain is wired, the more you have amygdala hijacks, the more you're leveraging that part of your brain, the more it's growing, the more it's expanding, in which case you're more likely to have them. Whereas if I can think about this part of my brain, which somewhere here is my right ventral lateral prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for my self-regulation, if I'm using that part of my brain more often, again, it's growing, it's expanding, it's increasing in its capability, which means I'm more likely to be able to regulate.
Exactly. So I'm curious, you said that you have routines that you do every single day.
Oh, absolutely. I use the science every day.
So what's like one thing, just one routine that you do every day to stay into that positive mindset or practice positive psychology and awareness?
Look, I don't think I can give you one, because I think the important thing I'd like to preface this with is what works for one person may not work for another.
That's very true.
There's a whole research on person activity fit. Many people advocate mindfulness as like the number one strategy, practicing meditation, mindfulness. I'm a big believer in treat yourself as a scientific experiment. You practice it for 8 weeks, you notice what it does for your well-being, and then you decide whether you keep it or not. Mindfulness doesn't seem to do much for me. I'm not a big mindfulness fan at all. But other people love it and they will absolutely swear by it. For me personally, I have things around my physiology. So I'm very aware of my physiology, of how I sit, how I stand. If I find myself getting slumped, then I will put my shoulders back, I will breathe in, I will lift up, I will do my Wonder Woman or superhero pose, those sorts of things. So that's something that I literally am very aware of every single day. I write a journal every night. And sometimes just it's a few words, and sometimes it's a nice emotional vent, because there's a whole great research from people like James Pennebaker on the power of expressive writing, etc. I do 3 things I'm grateful for, again, every night without fail. Now, the research tells me that doing it once a week is actually better for my well-being than once a night. But
Really?
The reason they found that is because people get mindless. So if I ask you to do it every night for the next 2 weeks, what they found is by Wednesday or Thursday, you're like, oh, I don't know, I made my partner a cup of tea. I did this. And we're not really mindfully doing it. So for me, the trick is when I am writing down things I'm grateful for, I stop, I savor it, I bring those emotions to mix. Sometimes I'll add a fourth. I shake it up a bit. It might be one night it's all about me and I'm grateful for every healthy cell in my body. One night it might be I'm grateful for people in my life. Sometimes it's I am so grateful for this amazing conversation that I just had. Sometimes it's global, I'm grateful for the sun shining. So I think the key thing when you do anything is, are you doing it mindfully? And I don't mean mindfulness like meditation, but in the present, are you savoring it? So that's something I do. But the other thing that I do all the time is, as soon as I notice physiological sensations, I go, oh, look, I'm having some data. How interesting. I always add how interesting, because it's not about judgment. So how interesting is really important to put on the end of that question. Then I ask myself what it is. And then I ask, is it serving me right now? If it's not serving me right now, how do I shift it? If it is, I'll wallow in that emotion.
What you said really stuck out to me. So I want to kind of connect to that. So you said that you say how interesting because you're observing very objectively, right? You said non-judgmental.
Yeah.
And I think compassion, especially self-compassion, is so important if we want to become a more authentic and genuine person and be there for other people. And I speak from a very personal place when I say that. I can't speak for everyone, but I know that when I was at my deepest, darkest places emotionally, it was because I was beating up on myself and I did not have compassion for myself. But once I did, I started to notice that I had more compassion for others around me.
Yeah, and what's really interesting is if you think about emotions as data, it helps you be more understanding of yourself, because there is no need to beat yourself up.
Mm-hmm.
You're feeling angry. Oh, look, you're having some data. How interesting. You're angry. There's nothing good or bad about it. But as soon as you put judgment on it and go, well, that's bad. I shouldn't be feeling angry. I should be over this by now. I should be able to handle it. That's when then we need self-compassion. But if we go, well, hang on, it's just data. It's information. It only becomes bad when I do something with it. If I were to punch you, that would be classified as bad. But the anger is just anger. It's just data. So I think that helps. But the other thing, linking to your point about compassion, and this is a lot of the work on specific emotions. We know, for instance, that when you think about guilt and shame, what's really interesting with that is guilt, we know, can drive to action. So let's imagine you notice you're feeling an emotion, you identify it as guilt. You then look at the trigger and you realize you haven't called your mother in 3 weeks or whatever and you feel guilty. Guilt is more likely to drive you to pick up the phone. If you internalize that and go, I'm such a bad daughter, I really should have called my mother, that's really awful, it's terrible, I'm really bad, I'm so awful, I should have done this, I shouldn't, and you internalize it and go, I'm a bad person, then we tend to flip our guilt to shame, and shame does not lead us to act. It leads us to
justification too, right?
Yeah, and of course
to justify, so we don't have that dissonance, or
Yeah, but then you do need self-compassion, because actually you're turning it into I'm worthless, I'm a bad person, etc., etc. So that's a really interesting one, that sometimes guilt can be really good for us, because actually it can go, right, come on. Same as if you're feeling guilty over a project you haven't completed or something, and then all of a sudden your procrastination turns into, right, okay, I'm going to do it. That's useful. That's a useful emotion. But if we turn it inside, that's absolutely when we need some self-compassion to go, hold on, I'm not a bad person. I just haven't done an appropriate or effective action right now.
And in our society, I feel like we're always attacking the person instead of their behavior. And that causes people to become defensive.
Yeah, look, it can do, absolutely. And, whether you're doing a leadership program on how to give effective feedback, or whether you're doing a mental health first aid program on how to ask questions, or whatever the common theme is the same. You always comment on the behavior, the specifics, what you've observed, etc. But again, a lot of people aren't taught that. So if I'm out with you and I see you're in a grumpy mood and you get snappy with somebody in a shop, my instant reaction could be, oh, you were so rude in there, Brittney. But actually, you're just in a grumpy space and you're not able to manage your emotions effectively. So therefore, it comes out in your behavior. So therefore, my best bet is to go, okay, well, her behavior is indicating something's off. She seems to be angry. Let me see if I can address the anger component, not you're a rude person.
Yeah.
But yeah, we don't get taught to do that. We don't get taught about the science of emotions.
Not at all. And I think that's so important, because that helps me calm down when I see people doing stuff in public that normally would enrage me and want to make me react in a very hostile way. I instead separate that from that individual, and I try to find the message or the need that is not being met that is causing them to have that emotion or that reaction.
Absolutely. I can guarantee every single one of us has behaved inappropriately at some time. And I always think of it as effective behaviors or ineffective behaviors. And I know I've exhibited some ineffective behaviors. We all have, because emotions drive behavior, decisions, performance. So when you're in an emotional state, whatever it might be, you may exhibit some ineffective behaviors. But it doesn't make you a bad person. It's about then stopping, noticing, figuring out what the emotion is that's causing it, and being able to move on with an apology if necessary.
And I love that we're talking about all the emotions, like across the spectrum, because when people hear positive psychology, sometimes they have the misconception that means that you need to be happy all the time. And that's not necessarily the case. So what are some misconceptions people have about positive psychology, and what is that reality?
Yeah, it's a really interesting one, and it's frustrating for many of us in the positive psychology space that often the media portrays it as, oh, we all have to be happy all the time. Positive psychology is so not about that. Positive psychology is about, do I have the tools and techniques and strategies, if you like, to increase the duration and intensity of my ups, if you like, and reduce the intensity and duration of my downs. So that's part of building resilience, it's part of increasing well-being and flourishing, etc. But positive psychology encompasses things like meaning and purpose and living aligned with my values and contributing and altruism and those sorts of things. And you know yourself, I'm sure, you can have a very low energy, negative emotion kind of day and still get to the end of it and go, I've made a difference today. Equally, you can have a happy, joyous day and feel like you've got a bit of a hole there because you don't feel you've done anything meaningful today. So positive psychology is much more about the science of human flourishing. And emotional intelligence, or the emotional element, is one component. But another component of that, as I say, could be a sense of meaning, a sense of purpose, a sense of giving back. It could be how you communicate, and what we've learned from positive psychology research around communication in teams or between people. It could be your sense of goals and moving towards things. Often we get taught sometimes by the pop psychology of like, visualize your goal, visualize your goal. Great, awesome. But also enjoy the journey. You know, you might set a goal that's very smart around, I want to lose 10 kilos by Christmas. But we know from research, even if it's a smart goal, people aren't likely to achieve it because they forget the reason why. Why do you want to lose 10 kilos by Christmas? Well, maybe so you can run around after your kids or feel full of zest and vitality. Well, guess what? You could drop 9 kilos and still get that. But we miss sometimes that why, that pull, that possibility. And I think for me, positive psychology, people give it a bad rap, maybe because it's got the word positive in it, I don't know. But it's about human flourishing, even during tough times. And again, I have many sayings, but one of my sayings is positive psychology is great on the good days. It's essential on the bad. And I have so many stories from our diploma students. So we run a diploma of positive psychology and wellbeing. And so many of our diploma students who have messaged me during this whole pandemic and said, I am so glad I learned these strategies before this hit because I've got the tools to deal with it.
Yeah. So let's talk about that program that you have. Because I think that is so needed. I mean, it's always been needed, especially as an individual, but also within organizations. And I feel like so many people wait until a crisis strikes and the building's already on fire before they look into programs such as yours. So tell us a little bit about your program and what you do.
So we launched the Diploma of Positive Psychology and Wellbeing probably back in 2013, so quite a few years ago now, and it was the first in the world. And we wanted a wellbeing program that was very practical. So you could go to various universities and do a master's and so on and do your thesis, and you could learn all the really important stuff. But we wanted people to be able to bring it to life in their school, as a leader, as a coach, as a parent, in their communities, whatever, with very practical tools. So what we've created is the diploma has university level content, but with very practical assessments, if you like, to gain the qualification. And I have to admit, I'm the most proud of this program. I never expected it to change lives, but so many people have told me that it has. I had an email just last week from a senior leader who messaged me and said, I have put into practice every single thing that you taught me, particularly around the positive leadership elective, and look at my engagement scores. Last year, her engagement score was 46%. This year, 94%.
Wow, that's significant. That's significant.
Huge, absolutely huge. And I thought she was an awesome leader in the first place, but clearly she felt it worked. But I've had people who've gone through heart attacks and have been in hospital and have been using what they've learned and have got out quicker, have had a more speedy recovery, all sorts of things, because they're putting this stuff into practice every day. And that's what I love about it. It's practical. And the funny thing is, you can't not do it, because if you want to complete the qualification, you have to do positive psychology because your assessments require it.
And I love that. I love that you I was about to say to use the word force, but I love that is a requirement in your program, because I went through a few certifications that I don't even put on my resume, just because I went through it and I'm like, did I really get anything out of that? Because it was all about learning and absorbing the information, but information is not transformation. So whenever you're applying it to your life and you see the transformation, not only does it stick more in your mind, but also it helps you to sell that to someone else, because you have your own life experience. And when I say sell, I mean, you are an advocate for it because you see the change that it has.
Look, absolutely. And I think for us, it's about experiencing it. So, you can read all the research that tells you gratitude's really useful, but we go, okay, here's this gratitude assessment. You go do this, and then you write to us about what you've experienced. And the assessments are only things like, 500 words on that. So it's not like it's big onerous, 10,000 word thesis. Right. But of course, you've then experienced it for yourself. And one of my lovely stories was we had a gentleman, probably mid-40s to 50, been in senior leadership roles, was giving back to his community around running leadership programs for a 12-month period in his local community. Very experienced, wonderful gentleman. He threw himself into it, got a lot out of it, but I didn't think much of it. He passed, all good. And then he happened to send me a message and say, look, will you come and talk at our graduation evening in Mildura, which nobody will know, but it's right out in what we call Whoop Whoop in Australia. It's sort of 5 hours from the nearest city by driving, and it's in the middle of nowhere. I happened to be in Adelaide, the nearest city, and I said, sure. There was no payment involved, and I was like, sure, yeah, I'll come and support you. And while I was there, his 21-year-old son asked me at the end of the evening, can I give you a hug? And I'm like, sure, I love hugs. I'll take, this was before pandemic, obviously. And so I said, oh, I'll take a hug, sure. And I said, yeah, just out of interest, why? And he said, you don't understand what you've done for my dad. And I'm like, but I haven't. Your dad's done stuff. He said, no, no, no. For 20 years of my life, my dad has been telling me about all these books I should read, the books that he's read, what I should do, what I should practice, etc. He'd read every positive psychology book under the sun, if you like, or pop psychology book under the sun, every leadership book, and he's been telling me what I should and shouldn't do. He said, for the last year, he has completely changed, and now I want to know what he's doing. Wow. And that, for me, is the pull. Yeah. This is not about read a book and learn stuff, and like you say, yes, I know it in theory. This is about you change, and other people then want to go, oh, what's Brittney doing? She's different. She seems to be really doing well. And you want other people want to know more, and you're pulling them towards. And that, I think, is so powerful. And I suppose maybe it's why I have an optimistic view of the world, because I do see so many people out there wanting to do the right thing. You know, I'm literally 3 times a week now, I'm running diploma groups with these most amazing people who are trying to do something different in their school classroom, in their change management group, with their kids, with their partner. And it's so awe-inspiring when you read assessments that tell you that somebody in a 20-year marriage is now reconnected with their partner. Somebody's restored a relationship with their stepdaughter that they didn't think was going to happen. Just by using what they've learned.
I love that. And modeling is so key, because talk is cheap. And just as you were saying with the father and the son, the father was telling him what he should be doing, and here's this and here's that, but the father wasn't modeling that for him. But when he started to see that, that's when it changed. And I think if we all could learn from stories like that, we would be in a better place, because it's so easy to advise people on what they should do. But if we're not doing it ourselves, then it's like, well, you're a hypocrite, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I'm forever sharing stories of this is when I got it right, this is when I got it wrong, this is what I did to rectify, you know, and we don't get it right all the time. We're normal, we're human beings. Right. But I do find the science, and this is why I wish people would teach the science, not just, you know, in organizations, let's do yoga and fruit baskets, or let's do a mindfulness session, and that's great.
Happy hours, yeah.
Yeah, but let's teach people the science of emotions, because as soon as you've got the science behind it, it helps you. It gives you a handrail that says, okay, well, this is what I'm feeling right now. This is why, this is what's triggering it. This is how it's going to influence me. This is what I can do. And we've got to make it real and practical. And, you know, we have a tools and techniques booklet with 160 strategies of how to manage your emotions. Now, they are all little things, but just reading the booklet is going to make no difference at all. No. But actually applying it, and again, it's one of our diploma assessments. You basically choose 2 emotional management strategies. You practice them. They have to be new, not ones you're already doing. You practice them for 2 weeks, and then you write about what you've learned. And if it hasn't worked for you and it hasn't done anything, so what? You've tried it. But if it has, keep it up.
I like how you brought that up too in the beginning when I asked you what are some of the techniques that you do on a daily basis, and you were very honest and said, well, this is what I do, but that's not to say it's going to work for everyone else. And when we talk about mentorship or coaching or advising, you know, there's a difference between all 3 of those. And I was just having a conversation yesterday. We were talking about how so many people want to give advice and tell people what to do based on their experience and what works for them. but we're all unique and different. And with your program, like you're saying, be an observer and write about what you experience, but then figure out, what works for me. I think that's so important, just experimenting. And I think so many people are afraid to do that. They're afraid to experiment in life, not just with those strategies, but many different avenues.
Yeah, look, absolutely. And, journaling is a classic one. Sometimes people love journaling. Sometimes people sort of turn their nose up and, oh, I'm not doing that. And again, my job is to share the science. And the science and the research tells us that for many people, writing down their emotions, PTSD has been shown to be significantly improved for many people, more so than therapy, by engaging in expressive writing. And yet that's not publicized. Everyone encouraged you to go to therapy, but actually expressive writing has been shown to have stronger results for some people. But again, don't knock it until you've tried it. And again, I had somebody fairly recently, a gentleman in sort of heading for 30, who did a writing exercise, and he'd started off by telling us he was dyslexic. His mum even called us to tell him he was dyslexic, even though he was nearly 30. Anyway, he did this writing exercise, and he ended up bursting into tears, because as he started writing, and during this sort of forgiveness expressive writing exercise, he said, I noticed my hands stopped clenching on the page, my writing became freer, and I realized for 30 years I've been describing myself as a dyslexic. But actually, that was me, and attaching that to myself and that I'm not good enough, etc. As soon as I let go of that, everything became easier. And what he's doing now is amazing. The new business that he's set up and what he's putting out there, etc. And again, when you see this, it's I don't know, it's powerful that somebody's prepared to give it a go and they get the results. Somebody else might give it a go and go, no, still don't like it. But the rule is, generally speaking, most scientific experiments are around 8 weeks. So that's what I tend to do it for. I'll practice something for 8 weeks. And if after 8 weeks I go, yes, that's boosted my well-being, then I keep it going. If it hasn't, I'm like, well, I'll share it with other people, but I won't keep doing it.
With the journaling, is it reflecting on what you've written that is so therapeutic? Because I'm not a big journaler. I've tried it before, and I love, like, I found some journals where I maybe wrote 3 pages when I was like a teenager, right? And I read it now, and all of those emotions come back to me.
Yeah.
So is it the reflection of what you wrote that one day, whenever you're in a different state of mind, that you have that clear train of thought to reflect from a different perspective? Or is it both in the moment and reflection?
Yeah, look, it can be different for different people. So I've written a journal every night pretty much since 1991.
Wow.
And I've got them all. And the only time I've ever looked in them was when David and I needed to get a visa for him in Australia to live here. And I had to go back and prove how long we've been together and all those sorts of things. That's the only time I've ever reread them. When you look at the research around it, it tends to be more the in the moment, and it tends to be more to do with things that are particularly emotive. So as I say, people with PTSD writing about the trauma and their experience, etc., seems to be able to help people create meaning, make some sort of connection between things. And again, one of the reasons that they found that this tends to happen is because of the structure of language. So if you think about language, it has rules. Every language has rules. It has verbs and nouns, etc., that get put together in a certain way. When you think in your head, you ruminate and you'll go around in circles. You won't finish a sentence sometimes in your head. Even when you communicate to other people, if a therapist or something, you will filter what you say. Whereas when you physically write, you're getting the physical connection of your hand to your brain by writing rather than typing. You're getting that physical connection, but you're also, through the structure of language, sort of almost forced to make sense of things. So it helps in that way. But there's some other really good research about the capacity of writing things down when it links to strengths and values. So there's research that suggests if every night you write down how you've lived and breathed your values today for 2 weeks, that has an impact on your well-being up to 6 months ahead. If you write down how you've lived and breathed your strengths each day. So at the end of every day, you know, I use my strength of narrator today because I did a really cool podcast with Brittney and blah, blah, blah. If I write that down, it reinforces my strengths, which means I'm more likely to keep using them, which again is enhancing my well-being. So as I say, the act of writing seems to have something that supports us. Again, for some people, maybe not. But for some people, particularly if there's something you're trying to reinforce or there's an emotive component to it, has been found to be really useful.
Isn't that whenever we speak and whenever we write, that's in two different hemispheres of the brain too, right?
Well, a little bit. We do have to be a bit careful about looking at the right and left brain, because it is a bit of a myth that's sometimes perpetuated. We had this initially that right-handed people are left-brained and left-handed people are right-brained. That's actually not true. Most right-handed people are left-brained, predominantly because of the crossover between motor cortex, etc. But actually, the majority of left-handed people are not right-brained. But they just hadn't studied many left-handed people before, because there aren't many left-handed people. When you think about the language centers in the brain, we've got Broca's and Wernicke's area that indicate one's to do with the words that we use and one's more to do with the intonation, understanding, that sort of thing. But we still know that there are people with half a brain that are still able to do expressive writing and are still able to comprehend and understand. So it may not be as clear cut as sometimes people have been led to believe, perhaps, about right-left hemispheres. Most of what we do is crossed over. So when you think about yourself, when you're imagining and you're daydreaming, and you're wandering off in your head, if you ever look at a brain while it's being scanned when you're doing that, so much of your brain is lit up. When you're being creative, people often had this, when you're creative, you're using this part of your brain, and when you're being logical, you're using this. That's actually untrue. You're using all of your brain most of the time. There's just different areas that may have predominance in certain things. But yeah, we probably have to be careful about being too cut and dry on that.
Right. That's true. And again, I think people try to simplify things and dumb it down so it makes sense, because we don't like things that are complicated. Have you noticed that in our society we try to polarize everything? It's either this or that, or you believe this or that. You can't be a fence sitter, because if you're a fence sitter, then we can't trust you. So
this is the interesting thing when you look at neuroscience research. People want to go, and we've had many books over the years, men are like this, women are like this. If you look from a neuroscience perspective, if you take a brain of a dead person, even a neuroscientist will struggle to find the difference of male or female, because it's not as cut and dried as that. But we know that there is no such thing as a male brain and a female brain. We all have both tendencies of whatever they might be. It's a culturally accepted sort of norm. Right. Same as I say, right brain, left brain. It isn't possible to turn off one area of your brain. And you're right, we do like to simplify things because it helps us understand. So we decide, is someone an extrovert or an introvert? Or we decide, are they a red, blue, green or yellow is a common, assessment tool. And I have to admit, I'm not particularly keen on them, because I don't want to be classified as an ENTP or a green or a pink or whatever I might be on some assessment tool. I'm a human being. And the other thing, and this is where emotions come back in, is if you think about the dimension between introversion and extroversion, and you imagine that somebody falls just on the extroverted side of the line on that dimension on a test. Well, guess what? If you're that person and you're feeling grumpy, sad, down, flat, lethargic, you have just moved more towards the introverted end of the spectrum. If you're feeling happy, joyous, ecstatic, you've just moved further along the extroverted end of the spectrum. So we need to understand that our emotions have an influence. We can't just put someone in a box and say they're this or they're that. It's just rude, really. And the great thing, one more thing, the fabulous thing that I love about emotions is it is completely inclusive. So if you think about the 6 primary emotions that we experience in the world, every single person, no matter the color of their skin, their sexuality, their age, anything like that, we all experience them. How cool is that from an inclusive perspective?
I love that. Yeah. I was interviewing this lady, her name's Teresa Quinlan. She's from Canada. And I love what she said. She said, we may not be able to understand what someone else is going through, but we can understand their feelings. If someone is sad, we may not be able to empathize with their situation because we haven't experienced it, but we can empathize with that emotion. And that's how we should start connecting.
Yep, totally agree.
Yeah. Well, Sue, this has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for taking the time to speak with me today and share your wisdom and positive energy about positive psychology. So where can people find out more about you and your program if they want to check that out? I'll put it also in the show notes, but I'll let you also share it. here?
So there's several websites. So there's suelangley.com.au or suelangley.com. There's langley.group.com.au, which is our corporate end of the spectrum, if you like. But if you're interested in the Diploma of Positive Psychology and Wellbeing, then langleygroupinstitute.com.au. And we have a webinar coming up that is free of charge if people want to come along and learn more.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sue.
Not at all. It's been a pleasure. Thank you,
Thank
Brittany.
you.
Thank you, everyone, for listening.